Coming up today on A Courageous Heart.
It doesn't change that God has a plan for you, and that plan is not dependent on the circumstances around you. And our God makes the possible things happen out of the impossible circumstances. And sometimes that's a person, and I just think that's amazing.
A Courageous Heart with Karen Dye.
Hello and welcome to A Courageous Heart. Once a month here on A Courageous Heart, we get together for a little girl talk. And what we're doing this year is we're highlighting different books in the Bible. Last time we talked about Mary in the Bible, the mother of Jesus, and this time we're going to talk about Sarah, the wife of Abraham. I have with me some of my girlfriends, and we're just going to gather around and do an old-fashioned Bible study. And hopefully what you hear today will inspire you. You know, God had a plan with all of the people he talked about in the Bible. They are still role models that we can look to today. That's the great thing about God's Word. It is so fluid, and it's appropriate for all times, all days, and all situations. So as we take a closer look at Sarah today, let's take a closer look at our own lives and see if we can learn something from her and her walk with the Lord. So let me welcome my guests today. We have Gwinnett Palmer here with me, and we have Tracy with me, Tracy Buster, and I'm so glad you girls came back. It's good to have you here. So let's get started with Girl Talk. Genesis, the book of Genesis, we first meet Abraham and Sarah. Tell me your first impression of those two.
I think they're a very close couple. And in fact, when you first said Sarah, it took me a little while because I thought, oh, Sarah. But now I think she's one of my best friends. And I think she's an amazing woman in how they work together and how God used them even though they made a few mistakes. Abraham as well as Sarah.
Absolutely.
You know, and I think that makes me feel good. You know, that makes me feel good.
Tracy, you had an interesting comment you shared with me before the show actually began about Sarah and how she followed Abraham.
Yeah, I picture them young in their relationship and God calling Abraham to these different places and Sarah going with him, not knowing where she would go, but being willing to pack up and move and being supportive, and maybe him not even knowing the details, just knowing that he wanted to follow God. And sometimes God calls us to do that in our relationships, in our marriages, sometimes follow and not always know all the details about where we're going.
That absolutely happened to me when my husband came home when we were living in Illinois, and we're happy. Our family was there, our church family was there, my career was going well, and he came home one day and he said, either I don't have a job or we're going to move to Missouri. And I can remember I was a fairly new Christian, not brand new, but not real rooted yet, and I thought to myself, is this that submissive part now where I can't throw a fit and I have to follow my husband, even though? And I remember Sarah kind of spoke to me during that time, the story of Sarah, and how she didn't not ask. She didn't just say, okay. She did say, well, where are we going? And so I felt like I could say to my husband, well, where are we going to go and what are we going to do? And when he responded, I'm not sure, I thought, well, Abraham wasn't sure either. He didn't know exactly where they were going. So that was sort of a time for me that Sarah really spoke to me. And maybe you've had similar situations where you've had to follow your husband, David?
I have, and I've felt like before, you know, I've told God it would make it easier if I had all the details, if I knew how this was going to work financially, if I knew what our life would look like when we got there. But I felt like God impressed upon me that takes no faith. If we have all the details, if we have all the answers, if it works out with the budget, that's really not a step of faith at all.
No, that's us
it's
relying on everything.
Proof, you know, and so, and I understand that. And part of those journeys, part of our journey is learning to trust Him and be closer with Him. And He does that through those experiences.
Absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the fact that Sarah and Abraham were not always Sarah and Abraham. They were actually named, their given names were Abram and Sarai. And God changed their names. Why did he do that?
He did that because he made a covenant with them. He called them to something great in life, and when he promised that to them so specifically, that he would make a nation out of them, out of their family, that many nations would come from Abraham. He changed their names. It was a significant moment, and we do that when we have covenants, when we have ceremonies, and some name change. We do that when we make a covenant, and God had done that with Abram and Sarah.
When we go into a marriage covenant,
We do
We
that.
do.
absolutely.
I think it's also Sarah, when they changed her name, it became princess. So she became elevated. And I went back into some Jewish history, and their traditions in Jewish history gives us some other insights, and one of them is that Sarah was a prophetess, and she was considered very knowledgeable, and her name can mean, there's a Jewish name which I can't pronounce, and it can also mean seer. And Jessica, never knew the name Jessica came from Sarah, and that was because she was knowing. She did know God, and she did understand, and they said that they elevate her more than we do. She is a very godly woman and considered the mother of nations.
So as the story goes, and again, you can read the story in Genesis, God promises in this covenant that he is going to bless them, make them the father and mother of many nations. But Sarah is barren. She cannot have children. So you have to look at that and go, okay, Sarah, what did you think when the Lord promised that? I mean, has God ever said something to you where he said, okay, I'm going to do this for you. You just have faith and I'm going to do it. And you stop and say, well, that's absolutely impossible. There's no way that's going to happen. Has that ever happened? Do you have an idea in your life about maybe when that occurred?
I think there's a lot of little things that we go along. I'm big on God winks because that's my idea of.
I love that.
There's a book about this, and it's the idea that somebody does something for you and kind of winks at you and says, this is a good thing, and that you acknowledge it. And I think these things happen to us, but we don't acknowledge them as they happen. And so if you think about God winks, or if you make it more accessible to you, then you're going to see where I just don't think this could possibly work out. There's no way. And then all of a sudden it does. Then what do? You just say, oh, great? Or do you say, wow, thanks for the God wink. Thanks for winking at me and doing that. And if you acknowledge those, you're going to see them in your daily life. You're going to see them in not just the big things. We can sit here and talk about the big things. Not having a child, that's a big thing. Can't relate to that. I had children, but I know it's devastating. And especially then when they couldn't do anything about it.
Right.
Exactly. So we have the knowledge of all these years, and they didn't have that.
I love God winks. I'd never heard that before. I love that.
It's tremendous.
That, and it goes back to what I was saying about, and Tracy, you could probably agree with this, that when God moves our husbands and we followed them, even though perhaps we didn't want to go, I could look back now and that's exactly what happened. I feel like God kind of looked at me and said, okay, Karen, you obey, you be submissive, and it's going to be okay. And the interesting part of that is that when I left, yes, I was somewhat in the public eye, but in a much smaller arena,
Right.
and was probably the most bashful person on the planet, and certainly didn't have a deep-rooted relationship with Christ. And I believe in that move is where the Lord sort of broadened my territory, where the Lord sort of gave me a little more confidence that, hey, you can move and you can go to where I call you to be because I'm going to be with you. And so he is always faithful when he gives us that wink to be with us and take us to the next level.
Well, and you wouldn't be who you are today.
Absolutely not.
When I left Kansas City 10 years ago, and not by my choice, but I was left alone, so I came to be with my family. And it wasn't until I just said, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. I don't know how to do this. I just give up. And I can say the worst thing that happened to me is the best thing, because I have been blessed beyond words. Even my stepson said to me one time, do you realize how blessed you are? It says it on the front of my computer. It says, too blessed to be stressed. And so thank you, Lord, that you put me through that, brought me here, and now, here I am on the downhill side of life. I'm not a young chick anymore, and I know that, and I'm kind of grateful. But the thing of it is he is just opening doors and blessing me. I'm sitting here with you. Who would have thought?
I know. Only
that
God.
day. See, only God. So he winks. Sometimes he winks in capital letters, in bold. And even my family does it. We do it in emails. I got a God wink today, Mom. Or guess what God did? He winked at me again. It's fun. Try it. You'll love it.
I do love that. It sounds a lot like when we get God's love letters throughout the day, and we just have to watch for them. Well, this was Sarah's deal. Sarah wanted a child more than anything, and she was barren and couldn't have one. And God had promised her that he would. He promised Abraham, I will give you a child. It'll be a son. And still, as close as Sarah was to the Lord, she decided to meddle a little bit.
But it was Abraham's seed that was promised the first time, not Sarah. She wasn't mentioned. And that was the culture. If you didn't have a child by a certain time in your life, it was perfectly all right to give your handmaiden. And Hagar was Pharaoh's daughter. She was also a princess. She came from a royal line, which I thought was quite interesting.
So,
well, it was perfectly all right culturally. I don't know that was ever God's intention for marriage.
Oh, it wasn't.
Was always, yeah, right. It was exactly. It was always the man and the woman, and so it certainly complicated things for her too. And I do think sometimes when we're talking about God or even to God more than we're listening to God. So I love it that she had a relationship with God, but somewhere along the way she didn't listen completely to how he would make that happen. And we want God to use us so badly sometimes that we think of how maybe we could use ourselves to help God. and it sometimes complicates things. I didn't feel like he was angry with her, but he definitely let her deal with the consequences of her having helped more than she was supposed to.
So let's talk about that. For those who are tuning in that maybe perhaps are not familiar with the story, Sarah was barren, couldn't have a child. So she gave her handmaiden to her husband and said, this is how we are going to have a child. This must be the way God had planned. And now I had this idea, and it must have been God inspired. So this is what we're going to do. And of course, Abraham was like, okay, I'm good with that. And so, he got with Hagar, and of course, Hagar got pregnant. And then what happened? Ladies?
She had Ishmael, and which sounded like that her plan had worked. Probably briefly, that seemed like a good plan. But as impurity does, it started complicating her relationship with her friend, with her maidservant, and I imagine with her husband as well. But
I'm certain, because you've brought someone else into that marital union, and I'm sure jealousy started to creep its ugly head into the relationship, both relationships, because Hagar and Sarah were friends.
Yes, they were.
They were very close. And suddenly now Sarah is mistreating Hagar out of what I assume to be just a jealousness. And you can only imagine Abraham, talking to Sarah about the situation and her feelings and how, he's thinking, well, this was all your idea. I just did what you told me to do. And how she's feeling insecure. And then he has Hagar, who is the mother of his firstborn. And she said, Sarah isn't treating me very well, and you need to do something about this. And Abraham had to be crying out to the Lord and saying, what now? What do I do now? Well, in the story, Hagar is so miserable that she leaves and runs away. And so Abraham is heartbroken because she's gone, his child is gone. But what happened? What happened to Hagar when she ran away?
God intervened and told her to go back.
Why do you think he told her to go back? And she had every right to leave. I mean, I can see us sitting there just like Hagar and saying, you don't understand, God. She is so mean to me, and it's not fair, and I'm not going to go back. How many of us have said, you don't understand, God, I'm not going to be the first one to say I'm sorry. I'm not going back in that relationship. They hurt me. I didn't do anything wrong. I did what I was supposed to do. But God says, no, I want you to go back. I want you to go back, and I want you to fix this situation, and I'm going to help you. So why do you think he asked her to do that, and why did she eventually do it?
I think he asked her to do that to bring peace. He was using her. He knew that she would allow him to use her. She'd reached a point of desperation with Ishmael, trying to take care of him, and crying out to God, I can't just watch him die. What should I do? And we get to those points sometimes, and I think it's nice when we can cry out to him before we're to that point, but that's where she was, and God used her to bring peace to that situation. And for whatever reason, the goal was that many nations come from Abraham and Sarah, and that was God's ultimate plan. And Hagar allowed herself to be used in that plan by going back and offering, to be a part of the peacemaking process there.
So Hagar goes back, and I'm wondering, how did Ishmael feel? I just wonder, as a kid, what he was thinking. Did he feel caught in the crossfire of all of this? Did any of this affect him in any way?
Oh, I think it did. I think it a lot. It cost him, and it cost him a lot of peace in his life. And I think we still see that in this day and age, because Hagar was upset and Hagar was hurt, and so she sowed some of those seeds of hurt into Ishmael. And so there was a discontent. I think there was a big discontent in Hagar, even though she went back, followed God, and he took care of her, and when she left the second time, he made promises. But there had to be a discontent that she was used, that Sarah became the mother of nations, that Isaac became who he was. Mm-hmm. But then in the end, Ishmael goes back with Isaac to bury his father. Mm-hmm. I like that in the ending of the story, to show that the two boys came to some kind of reconciliation. Mm-hmm. Oh, that they would now. Mm-hmm. But, that there was something there. That's a good thing.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Sarah did become pregnant well into her years, but God was faithful. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a whole story right there about finding out you're pregnant and you're in your 80s, I think is what it was, but God was faithful. And how many times do we think, well, if he's not going to do it by the time I'm 30, then it's never ever going to happen. All in God's timing, whatever it is you're believing for.
I think there's one verse, and I guess I think it's Genesis 18:12. I think that's amazing. Remember that. But it says that when she heard that she was going to have this child, she laughed, but the end of that verse says within her. Mm. And that's when God said, you laughed. He spoke to a woman, which was unusual in the Old Testament. And she, no, I didn't. And so she lied. But the thing that got to me in that verse, and I can't quit thinking about it, shoot, he's listening to everything I'm thinking. And I don't know if I like that. I think, so I've been trying to be careful what I think.
To hold those thoughts captive.
Because he's listening, and when I think that I'm being good and doing a good job, and then I have these little thoughts running around the back of my head, I'm thinking, he's listening in. He's getting really personal.
He knows the heart, and he is very personal.
And we need to remember that our thoughts are part of our relationship with God. Mm-hmm. Just like what we say and what we do, reading our Bible and during our quiet time, our thoughts need to be taken captive.
Absolutely. So she is pregnant, and they're going to have the child. And I want to go just briefly, it's a whole show we could do on this topic, because I know there are many out there who deal with this situation, and that is when the family unit does have impurity break into it and the family breaks apart. And you had two children now in this relationship. You had Ishmael and Isaac. You had Abraham, the father of both of them, but you had two different mothers. And when divorce happens in our day and time, many times there are children in the home. And many times, instead of putting the children first and putting the other spouse in a positive light for the child, we take out our hurt. And what we end up doing is talking about that other spouse in a negative way in front of the child. And someone said to me a long time ago, they said, you know, when you go through a divorce and you speak negatively about the parent of that child, you're telling that child that 50% of them is no good. 50% of them is wrong. Half of them means nothing. And that's a very tough load for a child to carry. And so you wonder, how did Ishmael and Isaac feel when they heard Sarah and Hagar maybe, you know, talking about one another, and this relationship that used to be best friends now is blown apart? And I think that's what the enemy tries to do in families, is he tries to sneak in another person. He gets our eyes off the Lord, and the next thing you know, the family implodes, and you have these kids who are now going to go off, lead nations, or whatever their calling is going to be. They're going to take that with them, their baggage with them. And you said something. You said, I believe Ishmael's mother, there was some discontent sown into this child.
I do.
And we're still dealing with that yet today in the Middle East. So, happy ending to the story?
I think the beauty of even broken families is that the children still can fulfill God's plan for their life, even if the dream that they had imagined it would look like looks a little different. And I love telling that to kids in ministry whose parents are going through something where it starts to make them question, now what was I for? What am I supposed to do with myself now? And how does that work? But it doesn't change that God has a plan for you. And that plan is not dependent on the circumstances around you. And our God makes the possible things happen out of the impossible circumstances. And sometimes that's a person. And I just think that's amazing and such a huge testament to his ability and plan for us, when someone can come up out of a situation that was really hard for them and still serve God's purpose for their life. It's a beautiful thing. So.
And I think on a separation, and we're going through something in our family right now, and the thing that we've talked about is both people in the divorce situation are children of God. Both of those parents are loved by God. They're his child, his creation. And so us, the rest of us that are stronger in our faith at this moment, at this point of our lives, need to be the example for that person. And also, if you build up the other parent, because this child, their identity is in that.
That's right.
So, like, then that's what happened with Ishmael. I've always felt that Hagar was so upset. And you hear that at home all day. It's going to affect you. And, you know, why should I bow down to Isaac? Why should I be happy with his God? And so I'll create it in my own vision. God promised me something, but he's not going to go to the extent that Isaac did and follow God in Isaac's, like Isaac did. So, and we're, like you say, it's still happening in the news every day.
Was Ishmael a mistake?
I don't believe God makes mistakes.
Amen. Amen. Did God have a plan for Ishmael?
I love that question, because he did. He had a plan for Ishmael. He knew how he would come. There were promises for Isaac and Ishmael to claim in faith and wait for also. The promises weren't just to Abraham and Sarah, but God had promises for all of those people, for Hagar, for Ishmael, for Isaac. And they each had to claim those promises in faith, like I think we're called to do as well. So I don't think Ishmael was a mistake at all.
Do you think that we do things in our lives sometimes to get in the way of God, and he allows us to go through the consequences, but do you ever think he's shocked? Do you think he was surprised when Sarah said, hey, I got a great idea. Let's get Hagar in here and we'll make her part of this? Do you think God was surprised by that? Do you think God was surprised by some of the things that we have done, where he just stands there and he says, oh my goodness, I didn't see this coming. What are we going to do here now? I've got an Ishmael where I had an Isaac plan, but I don't have an Ishmael plan. So what do you think?
I don't think I could say he's surprised, because it's hard in our minds to understand that God knows everything and he knows the end, but he also knows he gave us free will. And it's a hard way to describe that, because we think, well, if he knows the end, why does he let me do it? Well, because if I was a robot, I wouldn't do that, but I'm not. I'm a free person in God's love, and he's given me a mind, and sometimes I use it better than others, you know. And I've been to that point, you know, where I've just had to give up, and And he's been wonderful to answer, takes me on another path. It's beautiful. I love my life where I'm at. That doesn't mean I didn't go through the consequences. That doesn't mean we aren't going to have some hard times. But it does mean he does have a plan. He does know, and he loves us.
I love that. Well, I'm so glad that you girls have been with me today, and I know that our viewers enjoy when we sit down and we get to talk about these things, because it really is very interesting to look back and see how much we really do have in common. These people in the Bible were not characters. They were not pretend people that were dreamt up, that were given situations that they could work their way out. They were real people that were walking around on the planet, trying to raise their kids, trying to do their lives, and you know, do it in the best way possible with the relationship with the Lord. And we need to do the same thing. We need to understand that there is a God in the universe that loves us so much that he sent his only Son to die for us. Perhaps you've got in the middle of something and you don't know how to get out of it. Well, I'll tell you right now today, God does have a plan, and he's not surprised. And what we need to do is be like Hagar, be obedient, go back, take the medicine we need to take for the mess that we have created, but then accept God's help to get us out of that particular valley and move us on to something else. Learning. I think Sarah probably learned a lesson or two in her plotting and scheming and planning. I think she learned maybe not to do that so much the next time. Maybe to just trust God that he is faithful to do what he says he is going to do. So look up those promises in God's Word. Find out what he's promised you, and then grab hold of them with all of your heart. A courageous heart.
The preceding program was made possible by the generous support of our viewers. If you would like to become a partner with Karen Dye Ministries, please contact us through our website at www.karendye.com. If you would like a DVD copy of today's program, you may order one through our website. A Courageous Heart and Karen Dye Ministries, inspiring real people to live with real courage for Jesus, no matter what their circumstances. A Courageous Heart is a viewer-supported ministry.